Hey guys, got Saad here for the Saad Truth. First guest of 2017 is Dan Klein, professor of economics and Ginn chair at the Mercator Center, George Mason University. He is the chief editor of Econ Journal Watch, and we'll get into what is the raison d'etre of that journal in a second. Two authored books, Knowledge and Coordination, A Liberal Interpretation, and then Curb Rights, A Foundation for Free Enterprise in Urban Transit, and three books as editor: The Half-Life of Policy Rationales, How New Technology Affects Old Policy Issues, What Do Economists Contribute, question mark, and Reputation, Studies in the Voluntary Elicitation of Good Contact. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming on. It's the third day of my sabbatical, and it's so nice to now be able to do these chats without being under the gun in terms of teaching responsibilities and administrative duties and all sorts of other things. So I'm like a kid in a candy store. You're currently in Sweden, correct?
Yes, I am.
Is it you have a joint appointment also somewhere in Sweden, I believe, right?
Not a significant appointment. I am the associate fellow at the Ratio Institute here in Stockholm, but my wife and daughter are Swedish and live in Sweden. So I'm sort of in my other home.
Got you. Wonderful. So I guess the original place where I heard of you was in a paper that I've often discussed of yours. It's the Cardiff and Klein 2005 paper where you look at political diversity in California universities. And then more recently, there's a paper, let me just get the names of the authors correctly, by Langbert, Quain, and Klein yourself in 2016. I actually did a Sad Truth clip on it yesterday where you sort of followed up with the same general theme, looking at political diversity of the professors. So maybe you could start by talking about these studies and more generally why you decided to tackle this issue.
Those studies are a voter registration approach to measuring the ideological profile of the professoriate. There's been a history of voter registration research. Those two papers contribute to it. Surveys, of course, asking professors how they vote is another big source of information for that, as well as asking their position on policy issues. So there's, quite a body of research, and it all very much points to a very heavy leftward tilt of the professoriate. So it's documenting that. And then, of course, we talk about the problems of that, why the situation is as it is, what the trends are. I'm concerned, I'm unhappy with the leftward tilt of academia and of much of the culture. So, yeah, it's work in that vein.
Now, what people might not realize is, it's not a tilt. It's a gigantic asymmetric tilt with a capitalized T with font size 48. You're talking about departments that have I think Brown University in your most recent study has a 60-to-1 ratio. In your earlier study, sociology has a 44-to-1 ratio. When you talk about odds likelihood ratio or odds ratio, say in medicine, a 20% increase in your odds ratio would be considered a significant effect, right? So that would be the difference between 1 and 1.2. Here you're talking about, 60-to-1 and 44-to-1. So people have to understand the size of the asymmetry.
Yeah, Republicans really are very, very rare in academia and are getting more rare or all the time, it appears. People might ask whether, well, does that mean that all those folks, because a lot of the professors aren't registered, what about how they vote and how they think? You're not picking that up with your voter registration research, but the surveys do pick that up. And there's not that much of a change in the overall proportions and tendencies and opinions when you look at the survey findings either. So perhaps the voter registration makes it look a little more skewed than it is. But I do think, yes, you are right. It is very, very skewed. There are very, very few kind of non-left or left-leaning folks in the university.
So what do you think? I guess we'd have to look at originally how that trend began and then what perpetuates it? What are the mechanisms? Is it just that people like it's a type of homophily? People like to hang around those that are similar to them, and hence in the same way that we mate with those that are similar to us, birds of a feather flock together. This is what's happening in academia. Is that the basic idea?
I think in terms of perpetuating it, yeah, that's right on. Homophily, I think, is a very good concept here because it is almost a marriage. Someone entering your department, then getting tenured. You are part of a group that really is meaningful to the people of that group, and people do like to be with people like themselves. They talk about diversity, and what that means is that people of all races, all genders, all sexual orientations, all ethnicities are welcome here to join us and think the way we do. That's their idea of diversity. In terms of the perpetuation, in addition to that homophily and that kind of like deep, basically almost sacred values that they look for together, the other two factors I think that are helpful to understand it are majoritarian politics within the departmental decision. So once a majority of the department goes left, it will tend to grow, to reinforce itself and go from 51% upwards towards the ceiling of 100%. And the other thing is the pyramidal structure of the discipline, like the history discipline, with the top departments at the apex of the pyramid. Once they go left, they're generating all the graduate students, the top graduate students. They're placing them best. They're producing the most of them. They're placing them all the way down in the pyramid. And so once you got over 50% in the departments going majoritarian that way, and you've got the apex pretty solidly left, it sweeps basically left-oriented professors into positions throughout the entire pyramid. And I think that's really what's happened and is happening.
Now, so that all of those explanations address how the reality is perpetuated. But then if we go for first causes, what is it that was there ever a time when, had we done your studies in the 1930s, it would have been different in that the Democrat to Republican ratio would have been inversed, or is there something inherent about most of the people who decide to go into academia that would guarantee that they would be left leaning?
Those are big and tough questions. If you go back 50 or even 80 years, you would certainly get much lower ratios, maybe more in the 3 to 4 to 1 range. You'd never get the inverse, I don't think. Although, if you go far enough back, the D to R conceptions that we have weren't even the case. I kind of think it sort of starts with Woodrow Wilson in my own thinking. So do people of a certain ideological outlook more go for academia and more succeed in academia from the beginning, so to speak? Well, there is really no beginning. All of this is placed in history. The universities grew greatly during a period of Western civilization where I feel that classical liberalism was in decline, even in collapse. And so you can't really think of a beginning. There's just a story that goes way back to Thucydides, I suppose, or Moses. And I see what's happened in academia for the last 130 years as just part of a larger question of what's happened in the last 130 years. The growth of academia occurred during this move away from classical liberalism towards progressivism, towards social democracy. And so I really can't separate the why is academia left-leaning question from that much, much larger question of why Western civilization turned away from liberalism as it did.
Interesting.
And I know you're into evolution. I'm very big on the very deep-rooted theory of us having, Paleolithic bents and mentalities and penchants, and that the nation state and then the democratic nation state, clicking in along the lines of Hayek's theory of modern politics, where he says that modern politics kind of is tapped into an atavism that now kind of clicks for people, and we have mass politics of a very bad nature sort of all around us in this period of the last, let's say, the last 130, 40 years.
Very, very interesting. Paul Meehl, who's a very eminent psychologist, once said, and I hope I don't get the quote incorrectly, but he said that ethology rules academia, right? So ethology is the study of, evolved instincts, typically done on animals, but you could also study human ethology. And basically what he's talking about there is that many of these instincts, right, territoriality, dominance, hierarchies, and so on, are precisely what drives, academic realities, many of the ones such as the ones that we're discussing, right? I mean, so academics are ultimately Darwinian beings who have a tribal mindset, and we'd like to think of them as sort of the objective pursuers of truth, but oftentimes they succumb to a tribal mindset as per the DR ratio that is very easily explained from a coalitional thinking perspective, correct?
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't condemn people for being human beings, for being animals. We're stuck with that. It's all we have to work with. But I do think that we have certain tendencies that move towards political views, political thinking that is actually misguided, irresponsible. And so it is actually an argument about, why I favor these politics and not these politics. But all of it, I'm not saying that I, who favor these classical liberal politics, is like somehow transcending being human. I'm human too. I have instincts, and it's got to make sense in those terms in some sense as well. Anyway.
Well, political systems, and I've used this quote before. Some of my viewers might have heard me quote E.O. Wilson. Uh, Political systems ultimately will work or not, or political and or economic systems, as a function of how congruent they are with human nature. And so when E.O. Wilson, the famous evolutionary biologist and entomologist from Harvard, said socialism, communism, great idea, wrong species, because he's talking about the fact that, right, social ants have about as close as to an ideal communist system as you could think of. You've got the queen, and then you've got a bunch of equal, workers. Whereas when you try to impose communism on people who ultimately don't have the human nature that is congruent with that system, we do assort in hierarchies, we are not all equal, then you have problems. And so again, so the idea of marrying some of our understanding of political system and economic systems with evolutionary biology seems very obvious to me. And yet maybe we could jump to that now, and we could come back to our current discussion. As somebody who studies evolutionary psychology in the behavioral sciences, I'm always amazed that a greater number of the sciences that study human behavior have not been infused with evolutionary biology, of note, economics. Why is that? Do you have a sense of why it is that most people in economics still have sort of this anti-biology phobia?
Model building is a major genre
Right.
in the field. It's sort of a way of publishing. It's a way of doing research, and I think that modeling people as utility maximizing functions, it doesn't really lend itself to what you're suggesting. They're going to put certain things in the utility function, assume certain forms, and so on, and go from there. In some ways, I think that genre gives a misleading picture of what economists actually think or believe. Because, gee, I wrote that model, I published that paper. It doesn't mean that I think people are like that is a common attitude. Even the textbooks perhaps don't really reflect how economists think about other human beings. But I do think that those modes of operating, of publishing, getting tenure and all that, pull them away or steer them away from learning more about human behavior in the terms you're speaking of.
Well, so basically, what you're saying is that people succumb to careerism, right? They learn that there is, even in this noble profession called academics and the pursuit of truth, they learn that there are certain very earthly realities that they must adhere to.
Yeah.
And unless they have extraordinary testicular fortitude, then they're not going to say, well, I'm not going to play the game. And I think ultimately the victim of that is truth, right? Because you end up having people who are otherwise extraordinarily intelligent and well trained, and obviously with a lot to contribute, who end up being methodologically fixated. I love that term. It's not my term. It's a term that was introduced by Sternberg and Grigorenko in a paper in American Psychology. They talk about methodological fixation, right? So in your case, you're talking about mathematical modeling and utility maximization. In the behavioral sciences, say in consumer psychology, the methodological fixation becomes coming up with ever more intricate experiments, right? A 3x3x2 design, controlling for everything under the sun. The ultimate research question that you're tackling is profoundly trivial and banal and irrelevant. But boy, I talked like a scientist, I walked like a scientist, I quacked like a scientist, therefore I must be a scientist. But ultimately, it's all BS. And so I think economists suffer a lot from that because, in my view, they suffer from physics envy, but so do behavioral scientists, many of whom, again, wish to show that they belong at the epistemological table of the pantheon of knowledge. Do you think it could be as simple as what I'm saying, that this epistemological insecurity creates ever more rigorous disciplines that are ultimately devoid of interesting research questions?
I definitely think that's happening. I don't know if I don't think it's the whole story. There's some people who transcend it, who escape it, and there's also the possibility of adjusting a research system, a research program, and a method so that it captures a little more and does a little more. I suppose you could say behavioral economics is in that vein. But yeah, definitely people are concerned with getting published, with getting prestige, with eminence in their field, in their profession. And yeah, they've got to do what works that way, otherwise be less significant. So yeah, it's
So we're on
definitely
board.
part of the dynamic.
Now, your journal, and before I discuss the journal of which you're the chief editor, Econ Journal Watch. I love the title. It's very sort of Big Brother watching that you bastards don't do any BS stuff. I'd like to read you 3 quotes, and you'll forgive me, they're a bit spicy, by someone we both know. I consider him a friend, Nassim Taleb. So here are his quotes on economists. An economist is a mixture of 1, a businessman without common sense, 2, a physicist without brain, and 3, a speculator without balls. Let me do 2 more. Those with brains but no balls often become mathematicians. Those with balls but no brains join the mafia, and those with no brains and no balls become economists. Wow. And then finally, the curious mind embraces science, the gifted and sensitive, the arts, the practical, business, the leftover becomes an economist. Oh boy. Talk to us about this, Dr. Klein.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Does he apply those things to other academic people as well?
Well, right.
Uh, so, but I'm not one to champion economists particularly. I don't even operate myself that narrowly as an economist. But yeah, economists are academic creatures for the most part as well. There's a lot to what Nassim's saying there, I think.
How does your journal, in a sense, put those economists that Nassim is looking at with such derision, put their feet to the fire? How do you do that?
Critical commentary. We publish comments. Most of the journals have stopped publishing comments. It's rather remarkable. But we welcome comments on articles in the econ journals. And then, of course, we invite the commented on authors to reply, creating an exchange. We've had a lot of these.
I'm
So
assuming my invitations have been lost in the mail somehow.
your work hasn't been criticized.
No, I thought I would be doing the criticizing, but okay, go ahead.
Submit something. Be delighted.
Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So because Econ Journal Watch is out there, and to the extent that economists know that it's out there, they know that someone might, take aim at what they're publishing, catch them in some of their slipshod ways, important omissions in what they're doing, and so on, just errors often. So we are providing that watching, as you mentioned. We also do different kind of studies of economists, of their culture, of their judgments, of their institutions, of their practices, of their ideological character. So it's a mix of different studies of economists, basically, yeah, holding their feet to the fire and exposing, what they're up to and what they're about.
Does the fact that you do this, cause antipathy towards you from your fellow economists, or do they take it with grace and that, hey, this is valuable for someone to tackle and good for you for doing it? Or is it, how dare you be studying us as though we are mere animals at the zoo?
I think that reaction varies. Some of it is favorable and appreciative. I'm sure some of it isn't. Very often when we invite a commented on author to reply, they don't. Sometimes they don't even acknowledge, the invitation. So it varies. And it's hard to say, what people really think of us because they more or less just ignore. If they have a negative attitude, they generally would just ignore us.
Right. I mean, the reason why I ask it in a sense is because I don't know how much you know of what I do, but very much my whole career has been based on being irreverent to the orthodoxy, not by design, not because that's what I'd like to position myself at. That's just because that's what I am, right? In other words, if I see something that I view as incorrect or worthy of criticism or a new area that I should be going into, I don't care what the careerists think is. I just do, right? So thank you. So that interests me, so that the question interests me in terms of what you do, because I think regrettably most academics, while they should be sort of the heroes of breaking out of the herd mentality, are actually the exact opposite. And I think you talk about this when you use the idea of groupthink in academia. And that drives me crazy. So, for example, I comment about all sorts of geopolitical issues. Let's say, the dangers of religious ideologies that are, it's as clear as gravity that they are profoundly dangerous and antithetical to Western values of secularism and liberty. And yet I can't get more than a handful of academics to even like a Facebook post that I put up on the topic. So how can we get academics to break through their suicidal groupthink?
I think that's hard. You try to appeal to them, and it's good for people to be appealing, to be ingratiating if they can. It's not necessarily what I'm good at, but if other people are good at it, I wish them well, and I hope they succeed. Jonathan Haidt, I know you're a big fan of.
Yeah, he was on my show.
Yeah, and I think he's a great guy and ingratiating and clearly ideologically broad and sort of open. And his Heterodox Academy is a great effort along those lines. I think they're doing great work and represent that attitude and approach. On the other hand, there's more of just, maybe me, maybe also like you. I think we're kind of alike in this respect. We just kind of say what we think and do what we think. Creating an alternative and maybe taking down some of the prestige of the academic culture. So maybe not getting them to reform their ways, but reducing their status in the world at large.
And in a sense, what we're doing right here, I mean, we've got now these alternate or alternative platforms where we could
Yeah.
engage in the creation and dissemination of ideas without necessarily always going. Now, I'm not suggesting that we drop, our primary responsibility of publishing peer-reviewed papers. I mean, I love to do this, and I will continue to do this, hopefully forever. But having these other outlets, right? Our chat today might be viewed, within 3 months by thousands and thousands of people. And I will receive many emails from people that say, guess what? I just learned more from your chat with Dan Klein than I did in 5 university courses put together. So I think one of the things that I find astonishing is that a greater number of academics actually don't use these new platforms to disseminate and engage people about ideas, right?
Yeah, although it's clearly growing, the extent to which it's available is really astonishing, and it's almost like a problem. I think arguably it's even got a problem side to it of a complete lack of focal forum and conversation where the bubble problem, the echo chamber problem, and so on. I think that's a real issue where sort of what Edward Shills would call the central zone, the people in the center of governing essentially in the culture, lose so much power really and influence that they don't feel the same responsibility to the, let's say, polity, the nation, and that might actually be a bad thing. That like that it's become so fragmented. In America, it feels very much that way. In Sweden, where I'm at present, it's much less that way, which forms a very interesting contrast. Their central zone, so to speak, is more intact. It seems to be somewhat more robust to these technological developments than in the United States, perhaps.
Are you talking about in politics in general or specifically in academia?
I mean politics in general and sort of the culture in general.
Gotcha.
People still get their newspapers, and it's meaningful what's in the newspaper and the television stations. Even though you can now get 100 cable TV stations or whatever, there's still a sense of a central conversation. It's a much healthier political culture here in Sweden. But you're absolutely right that this does create a lot of alternative power, or at least the possibility of reducing the power of the older, longer-standing forums and so on, organs. It just so happens last night I saw a remarkable movie called Chuck Norris versus Communism. It's a documentary about Romania, essentially in the 1980s. And it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful picture about the dubbing of, Beverly Hills Cop and Terminator and Rocky and all the Western movies, and how that changed the political culture and it totally spread throughout society. So that was by our standards today, a very primitive form of technological development. But that movie showed how remarkably powerful that was and meaningful to people who participated in it. So it's like, to the 10th power today. So yeah, it's very unclear what's coming.
Well, yesterday, just to kind of speak about this idea of connecting with the masses and actually getting out of the haughty and smug ivory tower. Yesterday, I connected with arguably the number one porn star ever in the history of humanity. Her name is Jenna Jameson. This is where you could pretend that you've never heard of her. And anyways, so we've connected.
Pretend I have.
Don't pretend you have. I've actually had another famous porn star on my show, and we discussed, we had a very, very serious conversation, both about the science of pornography. This is where I sort of come in with all of my evolutionary ideas as to why pornography is so intoxicating and so on. And of course, she can speak about the practice of porn in a very intelligent and valuable, first-person perspective. And now that I've connected with Jenna Jameson, who will be coming on my show at some point, some, one or two folks, were scoffing at the idea of, a well-known scientist would bother speaking with such, actually one of them used the term prostitutes. And I thought that that's exactly the I mean, not only I think it's is it indecent to be treating another person that way, right? Jenna Jameson happens to be a very successful businesswoman who sold her company at, I don't know, 37, $40 million. She's written a best-selling book. I mean, you may or may not like the morality of pornography, but she does have a brain, and she is worthy of a conversation. But I quickly saw that smugness, not only among academics, but just followers of mine who were like, you're ruining your brand by reducing yourself to speaking to a mere porn star. And I think that's actually what smugness and arrogance is, right? And that's what happens in academia, right? We should only speak to the other five people who understand our paper and keep it in a closed, little club. And those masses are too dumb to understand or appreciate how great we are. I detest this mentality. What do you think?
I agree, of course. Absolutely. I think it's great that you're talking to her and all the people. At George Mason, one of my colleagues is Tyler Cowan, and he has conversations with Tyler. I guess he's a competitor of yours. I'm sure you inspire each other. And he talks to all sorts of people. I could even imagine him inviting a porn star on, frankly. So I think the attitude you're expressing is perhaps growing and
right. Well,
making inroads.
I do notice that, for example, I say 5, 6, 7 years ago, when I'd be invited to some prestigious business school or some prestigious university to speak about my academic work, people wouldn't pay much attention to my broader reach. Or tell me about, the fact that you've got this many million of readers on Psychology Today, or this many. Whereas now I've noticed that in the last few years, a greater number of business schools are like, yeah, okay, science, schmience. Tell us about how you became this famous, right? So somehow they've started to internalize the extrinsic reward metrics of actually doing work and having an impact on millions rather than on 7 people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that trend is in your favor.
Right.
It is real power, and it does deserve the respect that power deserves.
From your lips to the cosmos's ears. All right, so let's move on to some other topics within economics. So when I started my career in behavioral decision theory, the central focus then was on looking at Homo economicus, something that I call a unicorn, right? That creature only exists in the deep recesses of the minds of economists, and then demonstrating that, or the paradigm was, let's demonstrate how the axioms of rational choice are wrong. So for those viewers who don't know what axioms of rational choice, let me give you one example. If I prefer car A to car B and I prefer car B to car C, then I must prefer car A to car C by the axiom of transitivity. And so Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two profoundly influential psychologists, came along, and others did as well. And I was part of that paradigm during my doctoral training, where the focus was on trying to dismantle each of these axioms one at a time. But I quickly grew disillusioned with it, because ultimately I saw it as a not useless enterprise, but we got it, right? I mean, Homo economicus is a wrong view of human nature, and economists, no surprise, were wrong about some of their assumptions. What I was more interested in doing is actually looking at the evolutionary forces that have shaped a real creature called Homo sapiens, rather than worry about how we're different from Homo economicus. How do you situate yourself within what I've just said? And do other economists agree with this, or are they still very much focused on Homo economicus?
First of all, by Homo economicus, I'd like to understand that as what Deirdre McCloskey calls max U, the utility maximizing agent. Now, I do think there's some misunderstanding about whether, to what extent, such a presupposition binds you to a certain kind of person or creature. Like Gary Becker, I would say it doesn't bind you as much as you might think, because you can put anything in there, and you could also perhaps have the utility function changing in time, or being, dependent on time and circumstance. so that essentially any kind of behavior is consistent with the max U organon, if you will. But I do think that max U is not particularly appealing in and of itself. And it's actually more the max part that I find the most objectionable. The idea that we've somehow figured out a problem, the constraints, the opportunities, the preferences, and that we then maximize. Like you, that's not how I see people. And you're right that took over in econ in the 20th century. It was really stupid in a way, the way people narrow-mindedly pursued it. And then the folks you mentioned criticized it very aptly. So I'm totally with you. What's kind of ironic is I don't think David Hume and Adam Smith had any such folly notions. It's like I think, like Ronald Coase says, they kind of took man for what he was, humans for what they are. And so in a way, it's like we were up here with those guys, and then it fell off a cliff, and now it's like we're here.
Right.
Like maybe the behavioralists and stuff have like gotten some of this foolishness out of us, but it's like, hey, maybe in time we'll eventually like pick up again with David Hume and Adam Smith.
And I think you're exactly right, but I'd like to bring in the careerist argument again. I think the gentlemen that you mentioned were probably not deeply concerned about careerist issues, and therefore they could tackle the understanding of economics, and hence the realization that human nature matters in understanding economic agents with purity, because they don't care about their tenure and whether they're going to offend the feminist who doesn't think that there are such things as biological based sex differences. Whereas when it went down, as you said, it's because science became a career, right? It's not a calling where you just pursue truth unencumbered by everything. But the reality is some of us are here, right? I do what I do simply for the joy of doing it, right? I'm speaking to Dan Klein. It's not going to add anything to my CV. It's probably going to make me $20 from ad revenues. And my 1 hour is certainly worth much more than that in terms of salary. But I do it because I love exchanging ideas. So David Hume, not that I'm comparing myself to him in any way, but he probably was driven by exactly that bent. Professional academics today are not. They're professional careerists. And I think we need to infuse them with the strain of purity that David Hume and his ilk had, correct?
I agree. Yeah.
We got nothing to disagree about.
We got nothing to disagree about. He was turned down for at least 2, I believe, academic appointments. So he did go for it, and he was rejected, I think, at both Edinburgh and Glasgow. And he did provoke people, rub people the wrong way, and so on. It wasn't feminism in those days that was the point of controversy, the sore point. But
what was it in this case?
Theology,
right.
Religion, but I think maybe even more broadly, a kind of foundationalism versus Humean non-foundationalism, perhaps. Smith, you might argue, was more prudent. I don't know that he ever felt so terribly insecure, especially after his appointment at Glasgow. But I agree with you. I think of those guys as like really giants, and I think you're absolutely right that it could be that everyone today, or almost everyone today, is somehow contaminated with our academic institutions, our cultural institutions, in a way such that none of us can be as great as them.
Because of the institutional shackles that don't allow us to sort of let down our hair to the extent that we'd like to? Okay.
Including those of each person's upbringing.
Right. So
and edification.
Is there a way to remedy this, or are you pessimistic in that we could never reach the freedom heights that they were working under?
I'm not so pessimistic. I think that the turmoil and innovation, the dynamism of the technologies, institutions, and everything else that you referred to gives cause for optimism on that front. Like people figure out how to do it different ways. Tenure in academia gets so much criticism that maybe some young people will be tuned into that early enough that they can think more in the sort of giant way, the titan way, rather than the dwarf way of regular academics, normal science. Um, so I'm not necessarily optimistic. I'm just saying it's possible that none of us are as great as them.
Right. Uh, Continuing with the idea of shackles, what do you think about? So it's a two-part question. First, I'll ask you to comment about what I'm going to mention next, and then how do we remedy this lunacy? What do you think about the microaggressions and the safe spaces and the trigger warnings and the rest of the PC nonsense?
PC nonsense. We agree again.
But by the way, before I let you continue, until very recently, now it is starting to shift. I had a Twitter engagement with a very eminent psychologist who wasn't on board with me about how idiotic trigger warnings were. Whereas now a greater number of academics are starting to feel a bit more confident, undoubtedly because of voices, if I dare say, such as myself and John Haidt and a few others who are saying, what is this craziness? It's starting to shift, but the great majority of academics have still been silent on this. And so you and I think it's nonsense, but most of our colleagues don't. How do we get them to come to our camp?
You know, just keep at it. I don't know. Don't expect too much. And I don't think just because they're silent. There's a lot of just silent people out there in the professoriate who don't really necessarily like it at all, but don't see how to raise their voice against it. Don't see that it would do much good. And so it could be that the tail is wagging some of the dog here.
Right. It's incredible. I receive tons of messages from, sometimes it might be students, other times it's colleagues, some of them I know them, others I don't, where they're just documenting to me. I've sort of become a central repository of some of the craziness that takes place, the PC craziness. In many cases, it's in academic settings, but it could be in work settings and other settings. So it definitely is the case that a great number of people are feeling the lunacy of this PC nonsense. And of course, many will argue, and maybe you'll comment on this, that one of the reasons that gave rise to Donald Trump is a rejection of all this craziness, right? But people said, here's a guy who epitomizes the opposite of that. So do you think that, for example, something like what Donald Trump or Brexit and so on are manifestations of, at the collective level, people saying, we've had enough of this and we're taking back control of common sense?
There's definitely an element of that. I wouldn't necessarily accord them that description, but I definitely see that dynamic. I think of Timur Kuran's preference falsification work, where he says when people don't express their true preference and maybe just stay quiet, you can get dramatic sudden shifts that you didn't expect, because the private preference, the unexpressed preference, was quite different than you had imagined or seen in the publicly expressed preferences. And so it's possible. Well, in a way, the Brexit and the Trump thing are kind of manifestations of that. I think academia is pretty rock solid democratic in a way that we know. We live in it, so we know very well what the private preferences are as well as the public preferences. But in other contexts, like the broader politics of the country, that seems to be an element of it.
Why do you think, going back to our original discussion of the DR ratio, why is it that in economics the ratio is a lot less lopsided than other disciplines? Or I guess more generally, why is there such interdisciplinary difference on the DR?
Well, economics definitely stands out. It's quite exceptional. Econ very much deals with spontaneous order, if you will. It very much deals with how market forces interact to produce, different kind of results, if only like your breakfast. Um, and just any kind of serious understanding or investigation of that is just bound to encounter and confront this idea of a spontaneous order of good beneficial consequences that were not really the prime intention of the people making them happen. That is so unavoidable.
Right.
And to sort of reject any such idea of beneficial market forces, the invisible hand, spontaneous order, and such notions is just makes for such terrible economics that it's, I guess, it's one discipline where those central ideas just have a certain sway. And then many of the other social sciences are almost a reaction to that kind of thinking. It seems like to a great extent, sociology has defined itself as a sort of anti-economics.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say take on society. Like what's wrong with liberal economics, economic liberalism? That's in a lot of ways, that is the last 150 years of sociology.
Right. I was going to say that a lot of the ones that score very highly on the Democrat versus ratio is what I would consider in sort of the current parlance. They're the social justice warriors, right? They epitomize activism and ideology over the pursuit of truth, right? So, for example, when you have a radical feminist who might be housed in the sociology department espouse a position that, there are no innate sex differences other than genitalia, everything else is socially constructed. Well, I mean, that position is not only just breathtakingly laughable that it would be falsifiable at the average 2-year-old, but it could only, right, one has to work with the working assumption that the person who espouses such a position is not, a lobotomized idiot. And therefore, what drives him or her to take this position is that they are completely parasitized by ideology. And so what ends up happening, I think, is in sort of this hierarchy of the sciences, some fields are somewhat immune to this parasite, precisely because it's difficult to introduce this social justice warrior virus into them, right? And I actually did a Sad Truth clip recently where I satirized social justice mathematics. So I called it, we need to come up with a new field of mathematics that is called social justice mathematics, right? Where all numbers are equal. You should watch it. I sort of do this for you, right? Well, yeah. So I think the reason why engineering, the business school, economics tend to be less lopsided is because ultimately there is a cost to living in an echo chamber, in an ideological echo chambers, when you're building bridges, building businesses, trying to understand markets, and that's why you get a less lopsided ratio. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, particularly in reference to, say, engineering, where it is less lopsided. Physics is quite
Is
lopsided,
it?
however. I think so, yeah. Biology especially is lopsided.
Right.
Um, anyhow, um, yeah, it doesn't, people aren't necessarily accountable for their sacred beliefs.
Yeah, I'll mention one other thing, and then we'll wrap up. One of the things that really irks me whenever I actually mention your study, the Cardiff and Klein study, and then your more recent study in 2016, is that some person will send me some angry diatribe that, of course, professors are going to be Democrats. They're smart, they're educated, and therefore they pursue reason and logic properly, whereas those toothless, redneck, evolution denying Republicans are idiots and they're lobotomized. And of course, the person who says that doesn't realize that both, the rejection of scientific realities happens from both sides of the political aisle, right? So we think about evolution denying, Republican politicians, but they don't realize that when it comes to, for example, the rejection of a biological based human nature, or say innate sex differences, that comes a lot more from the left, right? So it's not as though, it's Republicans who reject. Look, I'm an evolutionist, so I'm only too aware that it is typically the Republican politicians who are evolution deniers. And of course, I'm against them for that. But by the same token, I'm against the left-leaning, let's hug it out, we're all equal, there are no sex differences. So what do you think about that reaction from those idiots? Sorry, not idiots, with alternative viewpoints, excuse me.
Yeah. I'm sympathetic with what you're saying. I agree with you about the denial of sex differences. That's something my wife has worked on, as a matter of fact.
She's an academic?
Yeah, she's a sociologist, a Swedish
Oh
sociologist.
boy, oh boy.
Yeah, so it's kind of a mixed marriage, but it's not as mixed. It's not ideologically mixed, particularly. Um, yeah, um, some, rejecting science for thee, but not for me, kind of thing.
Right, because usually the leftists will say when they reject a reality, it's because they have a higher moral reason for doing so, right? So, for example, when you think about the original deniers of human nature, they were cultural anthropologists, starting with Franz Boas, and then all of his students,
Hmm.
Margaret Mead, who thought that infusing biology within an understanding of human nature might result in all sorts of horrible realities, like the eventual Nazi reality, right? There's a struggle between the races. We're the Aryans, we won. Hey, that's Darwinian. The eugenicists made a similar argument. British social class elitists made a similar argument. And so, because they started with this noble idea that by removing biology from human nature, you'd be less likely to have these cretin misuse it, well, then it's okay if we've got this ideological bias because it is for a higher good. And I think, again, the Trump coming to power is, in a sense, the collective saying, we've had enough of this BS.
Hmm. I think there's something to that. Yeah, we agree.
As we end this fantastic chat, any projects that you're currently working on that are not yet public that you'd like to maybe use this forum to plug?
Well, I'm giving a lecture here, about 10 days on, it's called Liberalism 1.0.
Okay, tell us about it.
Well, the stars are David Hume and especially Adam Smith, and it's about the original arc of liberalism. It's like 17th, 18th century. It actually, it goes back to figures like Grotius, and I'm going to talk about what that original arc was about. And sometimes you hear the term classical liberalism, and people say, "Oh, classical schmassical," like you're just making up some idea of something that didn't really exist. And so I'm trying to make the case that no, we have something pretty solid when we talk about classical liberalism. That liberalism 1.0, say straight up through Gladstone, really did have a presumption of liberty core to it. And certainly it does in its paramount figure, Adam Smith. So I'm trying to elaborate that. I don't like relinquishing the term liberal to the left,
Right.
and I do not call leftists liberal.
I do the same thing, by the way, as you do. Uh,
Um, so that's one thing I'm continuing to work on.
any book that might arise from some of those thoughts?
I do hope to get all of my research on that together, but I've been saying that for a while. I'm more presently doing Adam Smith's multifaceted justice.
Very nice. Wonderful. Great stuff.
Oh,
Absolute pleasure talking to you. Stay on the line. I will put a link to your, I guess, personal website if people would like to follow up some of your work. I think you've got a list of all the different works that you've done, broken up by different themes. So I think that's a very valuable way of sort of,
mm,
classifying everything. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan, especially since you're all the way in Sweden. Much appreciated. Talk to you soon. Stay on the line. Cheers.